The people turned west. It was a cheerful journey to Jeopard, with Bracando riding in the lead cart. They were going somewhere that only a fool would attack. Many of the Mudrungs were frankly in awe of the small king, but Glurk was fast becoming an uncritical royalist. Bracando sensed his respectful audience and chatted to him in that special way that royalty has for commoners, which leaves the commoners feeling really cheered up without actually remembering very much about what was said to him. Snibble jogged along on the other side of the cart, listening with half an ear for any sign of fray and half to the deaf meanie's chatter. And then, in the north wing of the palace, my ancestor, Brock, built a temple to Kon, the founder. It took the white 7 years carving pillars of varnish and wood and laying the great mosaic of the carpet for Brock. We're still paying for them. The walls were set with jet and salt. The altar was made of red wood inlaid with bronze. Really, that was the center of the present palace, which was built by my great-grandfather, the 7th Brock, who added the wood gate when he was made king. And I mustn't forget the treasure rooms. I think there's at least 9, and only the reigning king may enter. Terra, the wood carver, himself made the crown, 7 pointy bits, with salt crystal on each one. We had a rug in our hut, said Glurk. And so it went on. Glurk eagerly followed the deaf meanie through the treasury and the armory, the banqueting halls, and the guest rooms, while the carts got nearer and nearer to Jeopard. Gradually, the carpet changed color again, from red to a deep purple and then a dark blue. They camped under blue hares, hunted the small shelled creatures that dwelled in the dust holes, and wondered if Jeopard was as good as Bracando made it out. Because if it was, it looked as though they'd better stop eating and drinking now, so that they'd leave room for the feast that they were going to have. The track began to turn into a road, not a great white road like the Doomy built, but a neatly laid track of thick planks on a bank of dust. On either side, the hares grew thinner, and Sneeble noticed many stumps. That was not all. No Mudrungs ever planted seeds. They liked vegetables when they could get them, and knew what grew where and which hares dropped seeds that could be eaten. But except for Pismir's private herb garden, everything that grew around them grew wild. The reason was quite obvious. To a Mudrung, if you planted something, you had to stop and watch it grow, fight off the animals and any hungry neighbors that might be passing, and generally spend your time, as Glurk would put it, hanging around. Vegetables to a Mudrung were something to give the meat a bit of a special taste. But in the blue land of Jabonia, around the little city of Jeopard, the deaf meanies had turned the carpet into a garden. There were hares there that even Pismir had not seen before. Not that great sturdy trunks that crowded the rest of the carpet, but delicate stems, their branches laden with fruit. Dust had been carefully banked up beneath them to make soil for all sorts of shrubs and vegetables. The travelers were shown ripe purple groats, which tasted of pepper and ginger, and big master mushrooms that could be dried and stored for years and still keep their delicate flavor. Even the track had been raised above the gardens. The small shrub-like hares grew along its border in a low hedge. It was a well-tended land. I never noticed that it looked like this, said Bane. It certainly looks better without Doomy armies camped on it, said Bracando. The men under my command were always instructed to treat the country with respect. Others were less respectful. Where are the people? Said Glurk. I'll grant you that a nice baked root goes down well, but all this didn't grow by being whistled at. You always have to hang about poking at the ground when you're a farmer. There were no people. The fruit hung heavy in the bushes along the roadside, but there were none to pick it, except the Mudrung children, who did it very well. But there was no one else. Snibble took up his spear. It was like hunting. You learned about different kinds of silence. There was a silence made by something frightened, in fear of its life. There was a silence made by small creatures being still. There was a silence made by big creatures waiting to pounce on little creatures. Sometimes there was a silence made by no one being there. And there was a very sharp, hot kind of silence made when someone there watching. Bane had drawn his sword. Snibble thought, soldiers learn about silences too. They looked at each other. Shall we leave the carts here? Said Snibble. Safer to stick together. Don't divide forces unless necessary. First rule of tactics. The carts moved on, slowly, with everyone watching the hares. The bushes just up on the right there, Bane said, without moving his head. I think so too, said Snibble. They're in there, watching us. Just one, I think, said Snibble. I could put a spear into it from here, no trouble, said Glurk. No, we might want to ask it questions afterward, said Bane. We'll circle around it, on either side. Snibble crept towards the bush, around one side of the hare. He could see it moving slightly. Bane was on the other side of it, and Glurk, who could walk very quietly for such a big man, appeared as if by some kind of magic in front of it, with his spear raised. Ready? Ready. Yeah. Bane took a hold of the dust fawn and tugged. A small child looked up at 3 trembling blades. It said. And 10 minutes later, a small group of deaf meanies were laboring in the vegetable lines between the hares. They did not look happy, or, for that matter, very well fed. Several guards were watching them. Even from here, Snibble could see the long snouts. Among the hares was Jeopard itself. It was built on a piece of grit. The actual city was a cluster of buildings. At the very top, a spiral roadway wound several times around the grit between the city and the floor. It had a gate at the bottom, but that was just for show. No one could have gotten up the road if the people at the top didn't want them to. There was movement in the dust, and Glurk crawled up beside Snibble. The boy was right. There's moles and snargs everywhere, he said. The whole place is crawling with them. They've got the city? Asked Snibble. Glurk nodded. That's what comes of running around looking for treasure when he ought to been home, raining, he said disapprovingly. Come on, said Snibble. Let's go back to camp. The carts had been dragged into the undergrowth some way off, and people were on guard. Pismire, Bane, and Bracando were sitting in a semicircle, watching the little boy drink soup. He had a bottomless capacity for food, but in between mouthfuls, he answered Bracando's questions in a very small voice. My own brother? Growled Bracando, as the others slipped out of the camp. But if you can't trust your own family, who can you trust? Turn my back for a few days. A year? Said Bane. And he called himself king. I never did like Anik Rock. Oh, always sulking and muttering and not keen on sports. But how did the moles get into the city? Asked Snibble. He let them in. Tell the man, Stefron. The boy was about 7 years old and looked terrified. They were everyone fought, he stuttered. Come on, out with it, lad. I think, said Bane, that perhaps you ought to go wander off for a minute or two. Perhaps he might find it easier to talk. I am his king! That's what I mean. When they're standing right in front of you, kings are kind of a speech impediment. If you just go and inspect the guard or something. Bracando grumbled about this. He wandered off with Glurk and Snibble. Oh, brothers, he muttered. Nothing but trouble, eh? Plodding and sulking and hanging around and usurping. Glurk felt he had to show solidarity with the unofficial association of older brothers. Snibble never kept his room tidy, I know that, he said. When they got back, Stefan was wearing Bane's helmet and looking a lot more cheerful. Bane sent him off with an instruction to do something dangerous. If you want it in grown-up language, he said, your brother took over the throne when you didn't come back. He wasn't very popular. There was quite a lot of fighting. So when a pack of moles arrived one day, he invited them in. He wouldn't, said Bracando. He thought he could hire them as mercenaries to fight for him. Well, they fought all right. They say he's still king, although no one has seen him. The moles do all the ruling. A lot of people ran away. The rest are slaves, more or less. Quarrying grit, forced labor in the fields, that sort of a thing. The moles don't look as if they be interested in vegetables, said Snibble. They eat meat. Pismir, wrapped in a blanket, had been sitting against one of the cartwheels. Travel was not agreeing with him. They almost forgotten about him. His words sank in like rocks. In fact, it wasn't the words themselves that were disturbing. Everyone ate meat, but he gave the word a particular edge that suggested not ordinary meat. Bracando went white. Do you mean? They eat animals, said Pismir, looking more miserable than Snibble had ever seen him before. Unfortunately, they consider everything that's not a mole as an animal. I don't know how to say this. Do you know what the word mole means in mole language? It means true human being. This sank in too. We'll attack tonight, said Bracando. No one's eating my subjects. Said Glurk. Oh yes, said Bane. Yes indeed, fine. 5,000 soldiers couldn't attack Jeopard. That's true, said Bracando. Excuse me. So we, said Glurk. Yes, said Bracando. The chieftain appeared to have something on his mind. I've heard one or two references just recently to we, he said. I just want to get this sorted out. No offense. As a reward for rescuing you, we're now going to attack the city that no amount of Doomy soldiers could capture and fight a lot of moles. You want my tribe, which hasn't got a home now, to save your city for you, even though this is impossible. Have I got this right? Yes? Good man, said Bracando. I knew we could depend on you. I shall need a half a dozen soft-hearted men. I think I can let you have one astonished one, said Glurk. We've got to help, said Snibble. Everyone's too tired to run away. Anyway, what will happen if we don't? Sooner or later, we've got to fight these things. It might as well be here. Outnumbered, said Bane, and you're not soldiers. No, said Glurk. We're hunters. Well done, said Bracando. Glurk nudged Snibble. We have we just volunteered for practically certain death? I think we may have, yes. This kinging is amazing, said Glurk. If we get out of this, I think I'm going to try to learn it. Night came. A blue badger hunting early near blundered into the line of would-be invaders and waddled off hurriedly. There was a whisper argument going on amongst the mudrungs. Some of them wanted to sing as they went into battle, which was a tradition. Bracando kept pointing out that they were going into battle secretly, but one or two diehard traditionalists were holding out for the right to sing peaceful songs, which would, they said, totally confuse the enemy. In the end, Bracando won by playing the king and threatening to have everyone who disagreed with him put to death. Glurk was impressed. When it began to seem Snibble that the dark carpet had no end, they reached the road again, and ahead of them, torches burning along its walls, was the city of Jeopard. The whites had built Jeopard. They brought redwood and sparkling varnish from Eligchair to pave its streets. From the hearthlands, they led great caravans of the rare jet to be made into domes and cornices, and cinder and ash for bricks and mortar. At the distant Highgate land of Vorgorns, they traded their varnish wares for beaten bronze, for doors and pillars. They used teams of sweat horses to drag salt and sugar in great white crystals between the hairs for making walls and roofs. And they brought different colored hairs from all parts of the carpet. Some became planks and rafters, but mostly they planted around the city. Everywhere there were gardens. In the evening light, it looked peaceful, but the Mudrungs had to lie low twice when Mole's cavalry went past on the road. In my city, too, said Bracando. You've got a plan, I hope, said Bane. There's another way into the city, said Bracando. I didn't know that. Didn't you? Said Bracando. Amazing. All that trouble to build a secret passage and we forget to tell the Emperor. Remind me to send him a note. Turn right at that little hidden track there. What track? Bracando grinned. Good, isn't it? He said. It looked like an animal path. It would wound around and about the hairs. The dust brushes were much thicker there. Planted, said Bracando. Eventually, when it was almost dark, they reached a small glade with another ruined temple in it. Temples don't last long around here, do they? Said Snibble, looking at the crowding hairs. Here and there were more statues, half covered in dust. This one was built to look ruined, said Bracando, by whites, for one of my ancestors. The one over there with the bird's nest on its head and its arm raised. He hesitated. And you're a Doomy, and I've brought you to the secret place, he said. I should have blindfolded you. No, said Bane. You want me to fight for you. Then I'm wearing no blindfold. But one day you might come back with an army. I'm so sorry you think so, said Bane stonily. As me? I don't, said Bracando. As a king, I have to think so. Ha! This is stupid, said Snibble. Why bother with a blindfold? It's important, said Bracando sulkingly. You've got to trust one another sooner or later. Who are you going to trust instead? You're men of honor, aren't you? Said Snibble. It's not as simple as that, said Bracando. Then make it simple. He realized he had shouted. Even Glurk was surprised. Well, it's no time to argue, said Snibble, calming down a bit. Bracando nodded. Yes. Very well. Maybe. But sure, He's an honorable man. Pull Brock's arm. What? said Bane. Behind you, on the statue. Pull the arm, said Bracando. Bane shrugged and reached for the arm. First time in Doomy's ever shaken a Deathman's hand, he said. I wonder what it will lead to. There was a grinding noise. Somewhere under their feet, a slab in the temple floor slid aside, showing a flight of stairs. It'll lead to the palace, said Bracando, grinning. They started into the square of darkness. Finally, Glurk said, You don't mean into the underlay? Yes. But, there's terrible things down there. Just stories from children, said Bracando. Nothing to be frightened of down there. He trotted down the steps. Bane went to follow him, and then looked back at the mudrungs. What's the matter? He said. Well, said Snibble. What shall I say? Creatures from ancient tales live down there. Thungorns and horrible delvers and shadows without number or names. Strange things gnawing at the roots of the carpet. The souls of the dead. Everything bad. Everything you get frightened by when you're small. Snibble looked around at the other tribesmen. They had moved closer together. He thought, at times like this, we all have to forget old things. Nothing's the matter, he said, in what he hoped was a voice full of leadership. Come on, lads. Last one in's, Never mind about the last one, muttered a voice somewhere towards the back of the group. We want to see what happens to the first one. Snibble tripped at the bottom of the stairs and landed in a pile of soft dust. Bracando was lighting a torch, taken from a rack of them on the wall of the little cave. One by one, the band shuffled down. Bracando moved another lever, and the statue trundled back over the hole, leaving them crowded shoulder to shoulder in the red-lit cave. All here? asked Bracando, and without waiting for a reply, he ducked into a tiny crevice and was gone. Nearly as bad as discovering all of your worst fears are coming true, Snibble thought, is finding out they're not. The walls showed up brown in the torchlight and were covered with tiny hairs that glittered as the light passed them. Sometimes they crossed the entrances to the other tunnels, but there were no monsters, no sudden teeth. The path began to slope down, and the light from Bracando's torch dimmed abruptly. Snibble started before he realized that they were entering the cavern under the carpet, with walls so far away that the light was not reflected from them. They passed through many great caverns, the path narrowing and spiraling up great columns of hair, so that they had to cling to stay on it. Sometimes the light sparkled in a distant wall. Meanwhile, they were edging along one place where the path narrowed almost to nothingness, and cold air rushed up from the depths of below. Snibble slipped. Bane, who was next in line, reached out with a great presence of mind and grabbed him by the hair, just as he was about to totter into the darkness. But the torch fell from his hands. They peered over the edge to watch it become a spark, then a speck, and then finally wink out. Something shifted in the dark depths of underlay, and they heard it scuttle heavily away. What was that? asked Snibble. Probably a silverfish, said Bracando. They've got teeth bigger than a man, you know, and a dozen legs. I thought you said there was nothing to be afraid of down here, shouted Glurk. Well, said Bracando, looking surprised. Who's afraid of them? Anything else in the depths below would hardly have seen them, the specks itching along in the roots of the hair. Eventually, Bracando called a halt to the edge of another abyss. There was a narrow bridge stretching across it, and Snibble could just make out the door on the far side. The king held up the torch and said, "We are right underneath the rock now." The roof of the cavern was gently covered towards its center, bowed under the great weight above it. "You are the only people apart from the kings of Jeopard to see this," Bracando went on. "After the secret passage was dug, Brock personally had all the workers put to death to keep the secret from escaping." "Oh, that's part of kinging too, isn't it?" said Glurk. "It used to be," said Bracando. "Not anymore, of course." "Ha," said Bane. When they had crossed the bridge, Bracando pushed a little wooden door open, revealing a spiral staircase lit by a green glow filtering down from a tiny circle of light. It was a long climb up the winding staircase, which was so narrow that the boots of the one in front tangled with the hands of the one behind, and the torches made flickering shadows of giant warriors against the walls. Ghostly as it was, Snibble welcomed it. He hated the darkness under the carpet. Before it reached the circle of green light, the stairway opened into a little landing, just big enough to hold them all. There was another door in the wall. "Where?" said Glurk. Bracando shook his head, putting his finger to his lips. There were voices on the other side of the door.